Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I'm Graziella Moraes Silva, the co-director of the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy. And we are meeting today as part of the Democracy Week, or la Semaine de la Démocratie. So since 2015, so basically for 10 years now, the Geneva Chancellery of State organizes a series of events in 1 week in October, so we are on that week, to promote debates on a range of themes relating to democratic participation. Since the creation of our center in 2017, we have been a partner of this week, so we are very happy to be here today. And the theme for 2023, this edition, is Celebrating Democracy, and it connects with the 100, my English in numbers is very bad, 175th anniversary of the Swiss federal state. And it's taking place officially since Monday until tomorrow, but actually at the Albert Hirschman, we started 1 week before. So we've been thinking a lot about democracy. And I was mentioning earlier, my husband and my son are tired of democracy at this point because they say that democracy is taking too much of our evenings. But it's been fun so far. So this year, the center actually organized 9 events, and those events are actually connected to our pillars. That's how we call them. There are 3 axes in which we work on. The first one relates to democracy with transformation of economies, inequalities, and solidarities. The second one is about democratic governance, participation, and accountability. And finally, the third one, which is very related to our event tonight, is about technology, democratic innovation, and media. In this pillar, we are very much interested in understanding how digitalization affects democratic practices and representations. In particular, we want to understand how the transformation of image production and dissemination also creates new dynamics for the role of images in the making of social relations and democratic politics. How the overabundance of information, including deliberate misinformation and disinformation, also affects electoral integrity and democratic processes. And finally, this pillar also includes strong ties to the policy world and explores visual representations of democracy through diverse media. And that's why we are delighted to host our keynote speaker tonight, Urs Gasser, professor at the Technical University of Munich and member of the board of directors of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And as you see here, Urs will be in conversation with Alexander Barclay, delegate of the digital policy at the Canton of Geneva, and Caitlin Kraft-Bookman, CEO and founder of Women at the Table. This event will be moderated by Jérôme Duberry, who is the managing director of the Institute Tech Hub and senior researcher at our center. We would really like to acknowledge the generous support of the United States mission to international organizations in Geneva, which funded since last year the visit of an eminent scholar connected to US academic institutions during Democracy Week. It's actually the 3rd year that they are doing this. So before letting Jérôme introduce our speakers, I would like to give the floor to Olivier Leclère, Deputy Director of Support and Voting Operations of the Chancellery of the State, Republic and Canton of Geneva, who will give a few words of introduction, as I'm doing. And I also take this opportunity to warmly thank the Chancellery of State on behalf of the Center for all the support and for trusting us as partners. Thank you so much. Please, the floor is yours.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's also truly an honor to provide this brief introductory speech to this conference on behalf of the Chancellery of the Canton of Geneva. I also would like to thank the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy for organizing this event and to celebrate this week of the democracy. For us, it's really important to celebrate once a year, and should be every day, the democracy, because we are happy to have such a good democracy in Switzerland, because Yeah, nowadays the democracy is more and more often as threats, and we should think about it every day. It's easier in Switzerland. This conference and the discussion that will follow will primarily address the transition from an analog to a digital ecosystem, ensuring also the threats to the democracy. We are all aware that our society is increasingly shaped by the rapid progress of technology. In the realm of political rights, there is an ever-increasing demand for reliability, precision, transparency, and within ever shorter deadlines. The electoral process in Geneva has continually evolved alongside the technology advancements. In 1960, with the introduction of women's suffrage in Geneva, it was on the same date in Switzerland, it was 10 years later, with the introduction of this women's suffrage, we started to mechanize the ballot counting in Geneva. At that time, we had people, 2 different people per paper ballots, punching cards, and they were electronically compared to see if there were mistakes. If it was difference between those 2 cards, 1/3 person would correct, and so we would have an exact result of all the elections. A couple of years later, 30 years later, the CERN launched its first web page in the 90s, and the state of Geneva started to have its first official website in 1996, following the referendum on Traversée de la Rade. The result wasn't in favor of the mobility as some people would like it today, but it was the first official website. In 2001, we started to use optical scanners to count the paper ballots because we introduced the vote by mail. So we got many votes coming back to the cantons, and the canton is counting all the votes, not like in other cantons where they are counted by the municipalities. So we had to improve the technology. And in 2018, we replaced those optical scanners with new scanners, the one from the market, and image recognition to count all the paper ballots. And it has even increased the fiability of the results and the speed of the results. And it's always one of the key points to get faster the results. In 2003 also, we launched the first internet voting. It was at the municipal vote, level, and the year after at the federal level. We were the first canton to do it. We've been hosting other cantons also in Geneva on our platform, and we had to stop it, unfortunately, in 2019, and we will see how it will develop since the Post has a new solution, and they are starting to use it since June this year. We also did several openings in the field of democracy. We opened the source code of our application, mainly for the internet voting, in 2016. In 2017, we developed a chatbot about how to vote by internet because people had questions. But when we developed this chatbot, we realized that people were more asking questions about what to vote, for whom to vote, than how to vote. So we had to stop it because the chatbot was trained not to answer those questions, and it was frustrating for the people. Over the 12 last months, we've witnessed the increased use of AI technologies, generative artificial intelligence, and we have to understand how it's working for us in the democracy. We've seen that politicians are using it to write speeches, but also some have been drafting bills with it. And now we also seen during the federal election that they are using it for the electoral campaigns. So with my team, starting in 2019, we started to study artificial intelligence and its impact on our system, how we could use it, what we should stop doing with artificial intelligence, because we could use to check many things, but it's again the deontology. So we are really studying it, and we are not using it in industrial way as we want it, but we were still studying this impact. So this is the point for the state of Geneva, for the Chancellery. And I give the floor to you, Jérôme, to introduce the next part. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Olivier. It was very, very illuminating to see how the Canton has been using technology in the last decades, from the internet to AI. So just to give you a little bit of information about our evening. So first we'll have a keynote of Urs, about 20 minutes. And then we'll have a panel discussion here at the table, and then we'll open up to your questions. So maybe a few words about you, Urs. So Urs is a professor of public policy, governance, and innovative technology at the Technische Universität München. He's also the dean of a new school, or recent school, School of Social Science and Technology at the same university. And his research focuses on the political and regulatory implications of new technologies, such as iCloud, or cloud systems, artificial intelligence, quantum technologies. And he's about to publish a new book on guardrails to guide human decisions. So it's also a very interesting discussion point. So Urs, it's a pleasure to have you here with us, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here and celebrate democracy with all of you. Thank you so much to the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy. Thank you also to the US mission to Geneva for hosting me, and really great to see you all here this evening. So the mission is a mission impossible. To explore the interaction between digital technologies and democracy in 20 minutes is literally impossible. And if you think about it, it's exactly 30 years ago that somehow the whole thing really started, when the World Wide Web, not far away from here at CERN, was made available to the public. And so we not only have to cover a lot of terrain and 30 years of technology and democracy interaction, but we also are confronted with actually next generation technologies that were already mentioned, including artificial intelligence. So what I thought I would do in my remaining 19 minutes is to just serve an appetizer for the conversation that follows with my brilliant co-panelists and colleagues. And so the way I'd like to structure is by offering 10 observations, or 10 hypotheses, if you will. So it gives me roughly 2 minutes per observation. Now, if I start with the first one, the first observation is the question whether digital technology is good or bad for democracy already has been a question early in the days when the World Wide Web was the killer application. Now, granted, back then, which also marks the time when I actually moved to the US, where I had my previous job at Harvard University, back then, I would say there was a lot of hope and a lot of enthusiasm that this new technology that makes everyone a speaker, back then blogs were the thing that we were excited about, and the websites that we could set up, right? that this new technology that makes everyone a speaker will create some sort of a robust marketplace of ideas, which is some sort of the ideal version of a public sphere, right? Where many speakers can form their opinions and share ideas and challenge each other. So there was a lot of hope. There was also hope that the internet would not only create this marketplace of ideas, but also help people to organize and find like-minded people to form new parties and to engage politically and run campaigns together. There was also the hope that all of this would actually empower people to bring forward their votes and be heard in formal democratic processes such as elections and votes. So there was a lot of hope placed in technology. Now, it seems fair to say 2023, these hopes are fewer. The headlines of today are more in the category of concerns. Media manipulation, disinformation, the role of social media, threats to democracy. That's some sort of where we have arrived 20, 25 years later. But nonetheless, I think we will discuss throughout the evening that maybe digital technologies' impact on democracy has been better than the reputation would suggest. Now, from a research perspective, it's very interesting that we don't have so much evidence, and the evidence has been mixed, what the net impact of technology on democracy is, of digital technology. So if you look, for instance, on the role of social media, you will find studies that say, well, they create echo chambers, they lead to polarization, and then you find studies, they say the opposite, and I think increasingly we find stories that debunk that myth, and I will return to that in just a second. But it's been a contested field, and we don't have some sort of comprehensive evidence to answer the question, has digital technology been good for democracy or not? There's one study that I want to just point towards, looking actually at the effects of internet penetration on democratization based on a large set of countries and analysis. And what's really interesting, the headline of this study, it's kind of a big data study, if you will, is, well, especially for not fully formed democracies, like early stage democracies, more internet and more internet access is strengthening democracy. And then the effect of more access is fading over time. So it's a very interesting large-scale study, but at least the take-home message is there's an argument to be made that internet penetration strengthens and helps build democracies. So that's as much as a big picture finding I was able to offer you tonight. So, all right. So empirically, we're still struggling, and we have contradicting stories, zooming in on different aspects, role of social media, and now everyone is talking about generative AI, what the impact on democracy is. And more importantly, what the interplay between the two is. One thing that we also have to consider is, of course, the evidence, the data that we produce in research is only part of the story. Equally important is what people think, what the public perceptions are. And it's telling that more often than not, headlines and media reports about what the supposed or perceived role of social media is, or of the internet is, or now generative AI is, with respect to the implications for democracy, is as important as the actual facts. So think back, Cambridge Analytica. I think Cambridge Analytica was a watershed moment when it comes to technology and democracy. The empirical evidence suggests actually that Cambridge Analytica did not really influence in terms of outcomes the 2016 election in the US. did not change how people voted. But the public perception is a different one. And the public perception goes back actually to an interview the CEO of Cambridge Analytica gave back then that was widely reported about, saying we at Cambridge Analytica, we create psychological profiles based on data we collected, and we can manipulate people or, you know, shape their political preferences and how they vote. And even though there is no empirical evidence for that, this idea has eroded trust and had huge shockwaves produced, challenging the idea that digital technology may actually be strengthening democracy. So you see, it's not only what the facts are, and there we have still knowledge gaps empirically, but it's also that we may have misconceptions and public perceptions that are as powerful or even more powerful than any study we could come up with as researchers. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that we need to separate, but both take seriously the facts, what we know from research, but also what people think the real impact is. Reflecting on 30 or 20 plus years of research and study what the impact of technology is, digital technology on democracy, it's also important to highlight that it started very much by looking at individuals. So as I mentioned, back in the days where the World Wide Web was very prominent, the hope was that it empowers individuals. I mentioned it, right? Everyone is a speaker. That citizens as individuals will be better informed because they now have access to much more information and can form an opinion about parties and the like, and the representatives that are candidates for office and so forth. So it was very focused on the individuals. And also later on, in the recent years, again, the question of fake news, for instance, has focused on individuals. Does it mess with your information diet? Does it trick you into believing something that's not actually true? So very cognitive, information-oriented, individual approach-oriented questions. What's, however, equally important is that, of course, that's only one way to look at the impact or the implications of technology on democracy. There are other layers, if you will, if this kind of a cake model, and that is looking at groups as well as institutions and systems at large. So I only have 3 examples out of this stack, right? So much debate, again, with mixed evidence, has focused on groups, including young people. So for instance, one question that came up is, well, the internet allows new types of content to emerge. That is some sort of blending the world of politics as we know it from the past with more kind of civic engagement, with more entertainment related content. And memes, I'm sure everyone has seen funny memes, has become a thing among youth in particular. And quite often these memes carry political meaning, and the creators are actually engaging in a different form of politics. It's not the party formal institutional politics, but an informal form of political engagement and commentary on societal issues. And so that's one example where the microscope of research was turning towards groups and populations, including young people, where arguably much interesting things have happened that probably won't be captured if you only look at formal and traditional politics like voting, for instance, right? Another example is looking at protest movements, and I'm sure we will talk more about that during our panel. So what's the role of social media in protests? From the Arab Spring to the umbrella movements in Hong Kong, in all these cases, mobile technology, so now no longer the World Wide Web, already the next iteration of technology, mobile technology has been key in mobilizing and organizing protest. Now, one can argue, well, that hasn't led to much more democracy. Look at Hong Kong, right? But nonetheless, it's relevant from a democracy perspective because these tools, these digital tools have not only enabled people to express themselves and organize themselves, but actually also put them on record to give them voice, to give them visibility, and create movements that have a shared history over time. So again, just a few, some sort of cherries on top of our cake model to illustrate technology and democracy is much more nuanced than just looking at election or mis or disinformation issues. There's much happening in different parts. The last example I want to share is moving to systems. While 30 years ago, again, the focus was more on the individual, I think we're now entering with AI a different question. And that is, will AI technologies give democratic countries an advantage over authoritarian states or vice versa? And so suddenly you see the conversation being elevated. It's no longer whether it's good for you and for me as we form our opinions. Suddenly it is, will the next generation of technology help democracy as a model in a global competition to be more successful than authoritarian ones or not? And we can discuss on what trajectory we are. I'm worried, and we can discuss, right, whether this worry is grounded or not. Fourth observation, I already alluded to it. There's also some things where we have now better insights than 20 years ago. For instance, there is now a wealth of studies demonstrating that contrary to popular belief, social media is not responsible for creating echo chambers or, more importantly, creating polarization. A wealth of research, for instance, shows that the traditional media ecosystem in many cases is structurally more responsible for echo chambers, especially in the US, for instance, that Democratic voters or Republican voters are primed to certain types of content and certain media outlets. And that social media is only reflecting a structural segregation, if you will, that was already in place in the information ecosystem. Similarly, a very recent study published in Nature, one of the leading studies in the field, looked at Facebook data and content, and yes, recognizes that people prefer to read content of like-minded people. I mean, come on. That's what friendship is about, right? That we like each other because we share something in common. But what is important, what this study shows and other studies as well, that does not lead to polarization automatically. So you cannot make the argument, because I'm listening and reading stuff and watching videos of people who think like me, I become polarized and basically have strong feelings against everyone who doesn't think alike. There are additional studies showing that actually social media users who are using extensively things like Twitter, now X and the like, are more likely to also consume content, to read stuff where other opinions are featured. So you see the picture here with social media's role specifically is more nuanced than one would think, and runs some sort of contrary to much of the headlines that we may read or say, well, social media kills a democracy. It's not that easy. The fifth observation is, and I again want to emphasize this point. Many of the conversations, essentially in the early years of the World Wide Web, but then also, I believe, mobile technology, have focused on the question whether these sets of technologies and practices are good for traditional democratic practices, including elections. And we've heard it in the introduction how the Canton of Geneva embraced technology to make voting easier and the like. But perhaps more importantly, and I jump here a little bit, is to realize that digital technology perhaps had a more important democracy enhancing effect outside formal political democratic systems. And I will return to that, but wanted to highlight it even here. So I'll skip to save some time. Now, what is an example of these other supporting democracy enhancing roles technology have played? E-government is a great example. So essentially, if you apply for a new driver's license and you can do it online, that's a simple example of e-government where technology is used by the government. There are more advanced versions of that, of course. And well, that may not directly create a healthier political or public discourse, right? But it does something really remarkable, which is it brings the government and citizens closer together. And so there is one empirical study, a meta-study of 60 empirical studies across the globe that document the effect of what seems like not so exciting, right? That you can file your driver's license application online. Yeah, one would expect that this is possible. But don't underestimate the effects of these sorts of communications that are enabled by technology. These studies show that actually e-government creates and bolsters trust between citizens and government, that it introduces accountability, that it increases productivity, both on the side of the government and citizenship. So while not directly relevant in terms of formal politics, right, you can see that there are trickle-down effects of digital technology that still create and support democratic systems by improving trust in core institutions of democracy. So what I'm trying to say here, there is some sort of a second and third layer. It's like an onion that you peel, right? Of uses of technology that have implications for democracy that may be less visible, but more positive than most of us think when we hear, oh, internet is a threat to democracy or AI is a threat to democracy. And this is one example. This is now coming back to what I mentioned a few slides ago. Perhaps the most exciting stuff and the most transformative potential of digital technology is not so much deliberative democracy. Yes, there have been success stories, and we may discuss a few too. So for instance, if you look what cities have been doing, Barcelona is such an example, amazing city, where technology has been used to do collaborative budgeting, where citizens are engaged in crafting the budget for their city or for their neighborhood, right? And similarly, you see models in New York like citizen assemblies facilitated by technology, so deliberative use cases of technology. And all that is some sort of living up to this idea that, to this model of deliberative democracy. So we have some success stories there too. But perhaps even more powerful is actually what happened if we take a different lens on democracy, if we use different models to think about democracy. So I just mentioned one, which is looking at more participatory and more commons-based experiences that technology can afford to citizens, to individuals, to people. Now, what does that mean in practice? And I hope we get back to this set of examples. Wikipedia. Now, granted, Wikipedia still has biases. It's mostly men, white men, contributing to it. I'm sure that's a structural problem that we have in society in our part of the world, for sure. But Wikipedia is an amazing thing because it's offering a new governance model, a new way to create and agree on the production of knowledge. As many of you may know, Wikipedia is an encyclopedia written by you and me, like us. And that's a paradigm shift, because previously, the previous model of production of knowledge was the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? You had experts selected by a publishing house, going through peer review mechanisms, and then the thing gets printed and shipped. But here, you have a democratization of knowledge production and sharing with interesting and sophisticated quality control mechanisms rooted in the very community of authors that together create Wikipedia. Now, think about that. Think about the power of knowledge that we're now so worried about when we talk about foundational models in the AI space. Who produces knowledge and who has control and access to knowledge is hugely relevant to democracy. And so suddenly you see, okay, we may not have thought of this example as democracy relevant, but actually it is. It's not the deliberative democracy model where, we talk about citizen assemblies or whatnot, but it's an equally important manifestation of a new way of governing ourselves as a community and working towards we share, in this case, knowledge, in a more participatory and distributed way than in the past. And that, if you will, is one success story, an illustration of what technology is able to do in this space. A second quick example, Creative Commons. Who has ever used Creative Commons to license your work? So the idea is simple. If you create a text or this slide deck, the creator holds the copyright, and everyone who wants to use the slide deck would have to ask me whether it's okay to share it, right? But technology and the hack has enabled a different approach to flip it around and say no, because we can, and believe in sharing knowledge with each other, we can create very permissive licenses and say it's okay to use whatever I put up here. And these are Creative Commons licenses. Now, what's interesting about it, these Creative Commons licenses also have a technical representation. So there's a piece of code. If I license something onto Creative Commons, there's a piece of code that makes it able to search on Google or whatever for this picture, photograph, painting, or text. And so we have now, I think, 2.5 billion pieces of work that are released on the Creative Commons. Now you may wonder, why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because copyright creates a monopoly right. And now we have a new idea, a new way to license things, and the technology that allows us to spread the work and find it. And that's a democratization effect again. So we're producing something for the common use, for societal use, by combining a legal instrument with a digital technology instrument. And that again, like Wikipedia in the other case, shows that there may be hidden gems when looking at the interaction between digital technology and democracy, if we have a bit of a broader notion of democracy, which of course is itself evolving. Last couple of observations. Fast forward to the present. We heard it already in the introduction. ChatGPT, generative AI, that's now the thing, as was the World Wide Web 30, 25 years ago. That's what everyone is worried about or interested in. And something really remarkable is happening. Remember, 30 years ago, there was tremendous hope that digital technology will help to strengthen democracy. I mentioned the dimensions of it. Today, something else is happening, I would argue, and that is that most people, including most experts, are worried that AI and generative AI is a threat to democracy. So it's a very interesting, different starting point. And it will be interesting to see in 30 years from now whether the outcome will be more along the lines, yes, concerns were confirmed, AI is a problem, or whether it's the opposite story from the internet, where we start pessimistic but may end up more optimistic in our assessment 30 years from now. Just as an illustration, there was a recent study by Algorithm Watch, it's a non-profit organization in this space, looking at ChatGPT and the answers it produces when you want to understand party profiles or what politicians think. They were looking at elections in Bavaria and in Hessen and in Switzerland. And the result is devastating. ChatGPT, not surprisingly, I would say, is making it up. I mean, that's what ChatGPT does, right? It's a bunch of calculations and statistical methods to make good guesses what sounds like human text. And these headlines are then some sort of fueling into, again, this public perception. And sometimes these public perceptions are good, or these worries and concerns are good because they shake us up, they wake us up, they activate politicians. But sometimes they may also lead us on the wrong track. Think back to the Cambridge Analytica example. Now, what's hopeful here is that the companies, particularly Microsoft Bing, said, we look into this problem. We have to fix this problem. And so after the study was released, there is now discussion, well, how could we reprogram some of these generative AI tools to make sure that citizens get not misinformed when they want to understand, you know, what the party profile is of whatever, pick your favorite party, right? No matter how we think about these different technologies, whether it's the World Wide Web, whether it's the mobile phones, as in the umbrella movement, or whether it's now generative AI, I think when we reflect back on the past 30 years, what stands out is, yes, it's a story about technology, but perhaps equally so, or more importantly so, it's even more a story about how human beings, how actors, organizations, states are using the technologies. So yes, the internet, yes, mobile phones, yes, generative AI, they open up spaces for uses that may be good for democracy or bad for democracy, however we define it. But it's not the technology itself that's the full story here. it's much more the question how we are using these technologies and towards what purposes. And so much of the bad reputation of digital technology should be the bad reputation of organizations and actors using these digital technologies towards purposes we don't like and that we think are harmful to our societies. And that's, of course, the harder problem to solve, because we know humans are harder to reprogram than computers. What it also means, and I just won't go through all the points here, is we also have technologies available that we can actually use to enhance democracy, to create more robust public discourse, to filter out or flag at least and identify misinformation and disinformation. There's a study that looked into various startups that offer AI not to create fake images, but actually to identify misinformation. And guess what? The technology that is available is not used by OpenAI and Bing and others. And so the question then shifts away from is AI good or bad for democracy to, well, what are we going to do as a society, as regulators, as users, as companies, that we put the technologies we have towards good uses that are supporting democracy and not threatening it. And in a way, that's a positive, optimistic version, because it also makes clear that we as human beings have agency. It's not just that the AI falls from the sky and threatens humanity. No, there are a couple of steps in between, and we can do a whole lot about it, both when we develop technologies, but also when we decide how we use these technologies and where we put the guardrails. And so just scrolling through, you see the book advertisement again of the forthcoming book. Okay, last point. 30 years of digital technology history, if you will, makes one thing clear. These technologies, they are born out of our existing power structures. That Google and Microsoft and OpenAI, all these companies come up with these amazing new capable tools has to do with our innovation ecosystem, has to do with Silicon Valley, has to do with how wealth is distributed, right? So it's very much the product of our society and the society we live in. So in a way, the distinction between technology over here and society over here, and then we see what the impact of technology on society is, that's a very simplistic way to think about something that's actually much more of a relationship. Now, there's one thing with technology you can also learn from history, that sometimes the most powerful technologies that in the short run may benefit companies or governments may also turn against those who are in power. And so I'd like to end on this note that maybe as we are worried, or many of us are worried about the next wave of tech innovation, generative AI, we can also look at it as something we can steer in a direction and use in a direction that may help rearrange some of the power asymmetries, some of the injustices, some of the divides, some of the participation gaps that have plagued us for many decades, if not centuries. So in some ways, generative AI may be an invitation to all of you, to all of us, to take 2 steps back and ask ourselves, how do we envision the future of democracy? How do we reimagining how we want to govern ourselves? Thank you very much.
All right. So thank you very much, Urs. Very interesting. From your keynote, I take two elements, two things that really struck me. The first one is around the question of who. Who designs, who maintains, who develops the technology? Because the technology is political. It's the result of decisions. It's an expression of values, of a worldview. And so when we're talking about technology, there is really this question of power, and so the question of who. And there is also the other element that you mentioned a couple of times, the question of agency. Who makes the technology, and us being human beings having the agency and keeping the agency versus the technology and a form of seeing the technology as something outside of ourselves that in a way is inevitable and develops by itself. My first question would be for you, Alexander. What is your perspective? You're the delegate for digital policy for the Canton of Geneva. What are your first thoughts after the keynote?
Thank you very much, Jérôme. Do I have to press on anything? No?
I think it works.
It's like magic. What you don't see here is that all three of us have taken a double page of handwritten notes and arrows everywhere. So I think we've all, your talk was very inspiring, and it calls for a range of observations. I feel, first and foremost, that what came out very clearly from your presentation was that this image of a digital duality is wrong. There is not, on the one side, say, a digital world, your virtual world, and then your real world. And this image we had for the longest time has come crashing down, and that's a good thing, I'd argue. The interplay between policymakers, society, institutions, the economy, and technology, they all shape each other. Where I do see links between our democratic process in Switzerland and technology is a notion of culture. The Swiss direct democracy, to a certain extent, I'd argue, has a lot of what we consider this digital culture, this notion of decentralization. The vote you express is the same whether you are a university professor or a street sweeper. So the same on Wikipedia, really. Your comment, your editing of such and such an article is not related to the authority you have. It is you are a contributor as any other, and a governance mechanism that is set up. To the use of technology relating to democracy, we keep having new waves of technologies coming our way. So if we had the same conversation a year ago, we'd probably have discussed the metaverse, and 2 years ago, blockchain, and so on. And so I do personally think the artificial intelligence wave of technological development we're seeing now is major and is going to have a substantial impact on our society and our democracy. The way we try to think about it at the State of Geneva is to look at a new technology and try to consider what properties does this technology have. Once we understand the limits and chances of these properties, we try to consider what do we want to do differently. What do we want to do differently? What reforms would we like to introduce that were not possible before these technological properties? And then we implement it and test it. And so how does this relate to democracy? We face a range of challenges that are increasing, that are local and that are global. And what I'd like us to think about and to discuss is how we'll be able to use these specific technologies to rethink our democratic processes that, as Olivier explained early on in his introductory remarks, have evolved a lot in Geneva and in Switzerland.
Kathleen, you are the founder and CEO of a great NGO in Geneva, Women at the Table. You're also a co-founder of the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithm. You're a passionate advocate as well. What are your thoughts after the keynote of Urs?
So I totally agree with every wonderful insight that my two colleagues have put forth. I think what I'd like to add, or just to embroider on your ideas of systems and powers and dynamics, which of course is a feminist analysis, because that's all that feminism is an investigation, an interrogation of power dynamics, writ large, sort of on male-female binary dynamics, but actually looking at sort of whole systems. So it's a whole of system approach and an intersectional approach. What's happening, as we see, is that we are racing to digitize everywhere, governments in particular, but there isn't a lot of reflection. So what we're taking sort of is our Excel spreadsheets, and we're just supercharging them in the public sphere without really looking at, for example, pensions, those allocations, the way that things look. How would they work now for the 21st century instead of a 1950s, 1960s context? And I think that allocations and procurement are one really big thing, which all sort of feed back into democracy because it's about utility of the system for the citizen, right? And we're very fond of saying we make our tools at Marshall McLuhan. We're very happy to quote him all the time, but we make our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. So we make tools, they're often with beautiful intentions. We've heard a lot of those sort of themes in the keynotes, but then we wind up becoming in the shape of these tools that we've made. So the first thing is, instead of racing to digitize, to spend more time reflecting, but also maybe more time course correcting, to use these powerful tools that we've invented, to think about not to mitigate the bias, because we all know that there's all this terrible gender bias in all of these tools because they've all been taken from sort of the corpus of the internet. But instead of just saying, how do we stop things at the level of bias that they exist now, how do we actually course correct? How do we use them to actually create this new democracy that you alluded to in your closing? I'm going to use the example of Wikipedia, which you both used, as an example of that. So it's fabulous that we have Wikipedia. It's fabulous that there's a new corpus of knowledge, and it's democratized. So we're all for that. What we need to do, the next step, that was the first step, is to include a broader range of people who are creating, because we know that Wikipedia, a couple of things, mostly in English, but we also know that it's only 20% of the contributors are women. And there have been new studies now that show that even when women put their 20% of their information on the Wikipedia thing, they're more likely, 25% more likely to have it taken down by other editors. So it doesn't even stay up. That they're huge, evidently there are 4, 5, 6 structural barriers in the women's information being taken down all the time. And so that there, in some ways, is that those fabulous democratized groups of guys are acting as the gatekeepers, as the publishers. So they've sort of replicated the old power structures and the old kind of authority. I just want to say one more thing too. Use the word, which we often use, and it was in your slide, of efficiency. And when we look at government services, we think about being more efficient. And we've come to think of this, and we've just done a paper for GIZ on digital public infrastructure with an intersectional gender lens, is what if we looked at the idea of effectiveness? So instead of being faster, better traffic lights, faster DMV stuff, all of which we want, on the other hand, how do we look at things that citizens actually have a more robust, more humane, fair allocation of services, and that's also a little bit of a paradigm shift, all of which comes back, I think, to democracy, because if we're going to advocate for the democratic system, which I would be the first person out on the streets to cheer for, we're going to have to show that it really brings how much value it brings to the citizen, all of us. So anyway.
Thank you, Kathleen.
You're welcome.
We're talking about values. Also, you've had an experience both now in the US and in Europe. Do you see a very different or a different perspective when it comes to technology, digital technology and democracy, and also in terms of regulation?
It's an interesting reframing of the question. We had a brief chat before the event and we had a similar exchange. So I do believe that we, at least in my experience, I have to limit to that, that the US and Europe, we share more in common that separates us when it comes to value when we talk about democracy and how we want to live our lives. I do a lot of work in Asia, and there I would say we have much starker contrasts in terms of the value system. So I feel, relatively speaking, on a continuum, the values between US and Europe, as diverse as both big regions are more aligned than not. However, that being said, how we put into operation these values and how we some sort of get practical about it, especially when it comes to technology, that we have seen different approaches. You're alluding to regulation as one instrument in the toolbox, and indeed, there's a strong push right now, and over the past few years for sure, in Europe to use the tool of lawmaking and regulation to live up and to some sort of ensure that the European values are secured at the moment where technologies such as AI become more and more important and may challenge some of these values because they may reinforce bias or create new vulnerabilities and the like. So very much a strong instinct to get into the toolbox and take the regulation hammer, I would tempted to say, out and use that as the way to get to the values. In the US, and of course this is oversimplifying it, I think there is more inclination to look at at creativity, is more inclination to look at innovation, both mostly maybe technical innovation, but also business model innovation, maybe even social innovation, to find new arrangements that give new meaning and new life to the values using the technical artifacts where we've made so much progress, and where regulation is used more cautiously and maybe sometimes also later in the process. And if it's used, then often in the spirit of something that enables technology to be used. So it's very interesting. We did a mapping about a year ago of different legislation on AI, both in European countries and the US, and especially at the US state level. So bills that are introduced regulating AI. Big surprise from the study was the US has actually more laws and draft laws in the pipeline than Europe, which seems to contradict what I just described. But the trick is, if you then do a content analysis of these different laws and regulations in the US and compare it to Europe, you see that the laws in Europe are predominantly laws that say what you're not able to do, what you're not supposed to do, both as a developer or user of technology, while many of the state laws and also city level laws in the US are actually mandating the government to use technologies such as AI, for instance, to improve efficiency in certain areas. And so values, I'd say, we're still part of a Western world. Instruments, some differences, add more. Yeah.
Thank you, Alexander. I'm turning to you. Thank you, Urs. I'm turning to you, Alexander, as representing the state and the Canton of Geneva. What is your perspective on the regulation of technology or the relation between the state and technology?
So in the Swiss model, supposedly all regulations, all lawmaking comes from the citizens and goes back to the citizens. So we have the system both of the initiative, so any citizen who's really angry about something or wants to propose something can launch an initiative on constitutional level, and any law that comes out of parliament is open to being challenged by a referendum. And so in Switzerland, you need 50,000 signatures to oppose a law that came out of parliament and then get the whole population to vote on it. When we look at recent regulations around technology, I think there's one case that is interesting to look at in Switzerland, and that's EID. You mentioned in your presentation how important trust is. Trust in e-government services. You need to be able to trust your state, and that is part of democracy as well. We know governments, as all organizations, are under increasing stress and threats from cyber criminals. So you don't want the data you provide to the government to be used against you in contexts outside of the use you gave it to the government for. And so on a national level, the National Parliament elaborated a law for EID, a digital identity for Switzerland that gave a major role to private actors. Because typically in Switzerland, we have this logic, let's say on a national level, that eventually, when we're talking about technology, the private sector does it better. So let's let them do it, it'll be more efficient. The majority of the parliament voted for that law. The majority of cantons, of actors in civil society supported that law. The vote was in March 2021 following a referendum, and to the surprise of many, many players, the Swiss population refused that law. So threw away 3 to 5 years of legislative work on an EID. Result, today we don't have an EID, but the National Parliament is working with the federal government on a law for an EID that gives a major role to the state. So the state emits the digital identity, will provide a digital public infrastructure that any other actor, public or private, can emit the moyens de preuve électronique, so digital proof, be it your driver's license, be it a cinema ticket, etc., etc. And so that's studying what is possible with technology today and tomorrow. The analysis after the vote showed that people refused that law because they wanted their identity to be provided by the state and not by the private sector. Likewise, in June in Geneva, we had a vote on a modification of the cantonal constitution. And that led to the introduction of a new fundamental right. So anyone living in Geneva now has a new fundamental right to digital integrity. So that's like the physical integrity, psychic integrity, intégrité psychique, and now a digital integrity. So the state must protect you. The state must enable you to interact with it outside of digital channels. So you have now a constitutional right to address the state outside of digital channels. That's one thing. And then perhaps something else, getting back to the point on the digital culture. We have in Switzerland very strong democratic instruments. You mentioned a lot of the discussion around this focuses on these very formal democratic processes. We have plenty of opportunities outside of these democratic processes to engage more strongly in collective decision-making. That can be through digital technology or outside of digital technology. So you mentioned the city of Barcelona and all the magnificent projects they've set up. The Canton of Geneva has set up a participatory platform using exactly the same tool. It's an open source tool. It has a lot to offer in terms of transparency for trust in engaging with communities on specific projects of the government. You can look it up on participer.ge.ch. I feel as a state representative, I do have to plug our website every now and then, though. And experimenting with new forms of deliberative assemblies. We just had a communication this week on the results 1 year after a council on climate change. So how do we collectively want to work on these issues? That was very little digital in it, but the process itself is the result of digital culture, I'd argue.
Thank you, Alexander. Kathleen, you mentioned the fact that the way digital technology is designed, developed, is clearly not diverse or representative of the users. What are the initiatives that you would like to flag that bring these communities into the driving seat of technology design, technology governance?
That's a good question. Okay, I didn't know that was coming. I think one of the things we're trying to do, and I have just revisited today for something else, a standard for which we were the technical author for the British, for BSI, on inclusive digital data. We tried to redefine what an expert was. Because we say expert, we say technical expert, and immediately it makes an authority of these, of the computer scientists, because we're never going to go. I'm a great believer in quantitative, that girls should learn to code, but that's a little bit like saying, oh, we should have more Greta Thunbergs, and then we wouldn't have climate change. We're just not going to get there fast enough with all the 15-year-old girls learning to code. But what we do need is we need community engagement when we're creating technology, and we need different domain expertise. So we need, if we're making a health app, we need doctors and nurses and nurse practitioners and midwives and people who are just like in the doctor's office as well as patients. And we need ecosystems worth of people who are helping to create this technology. And then this inclusion ecosystem, then add the technologists, because technology is too important to be left to technologists, in our opinion. So it's to broaden the domain expertise and really beginning with community engagement, which we're just learning how to do. And that could be one of the ways that we reimagine democracy together, is to be, because also one of you had written about the more local, the more important it was. And I do think that that's actually an important point. What is the other thing? I also think that there are levers, structural levers of government, and one that I'm particularly fond of is public procurement, which drives more in the global south than any place else, but certainly all across the world, it's massive amounts of money flow. And if you did have some set-asides for women-owned businesses, set-asides for gender-responsive teams, incentivized teams that were going for procurement, to have different domain expertise on their teams, different kinds of women. We see in Sri Lanka, these set-asides work. That in, if I just to say one public procurement story that we're fond of, in Sri Lanka, it started where they didn't have any sort of telecommunication infrastructure. They insisted that they put Sri Lankans on these teams with Microsoft. In the beginning, of course, they were just people who were just doing data call center stuff. It really wasn't very much. But after 15 years, everybody had gotten the kind of expertise that they needed, where they are now, Sri Lankans, winning the bids in Africa to run things that are going up against Microsoft. So you also can start pathways so people can be trained and they can have the expertise, and you can expand, you can expand your sort of intellectual tribe. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathleen.
You're welcome.
I'm turning to you. I hope that you have a lot of questions. Here's one, please. I don't know if we have a mic. Yes, we have a microphone. Goes like we're trying to do on digital sovereignty.
Briefly and concisely, yes. I will share, yes, about, yes, Wikipedia. And let me start, yes. Or Creative Commons. Yes, Wikipedia, and there is more than 1 million articles, but we are aware that anybody can publish in Wikipedia. Wikipedia, it's not an academic tool. Encyclopedia Universalis, Encyclopedia Britannica, not anybody. The famous professor who is honorary professor have been requested by Encyclopedia Britannica about this subject. And this is why. But to be professor, for example, Geneva University, how many articles you publish? Yes, your PhD. How many articles in scientific journals? Because it's scientific journals, not like any journals. And this scientific journal, there is scientific committee who decide the publication. How many articles you published last 2 years? And the feedback student and others. Then renewable. He can in Geneva University. Other countries maybe. Yes, Creative Commons. Also, yes, it's true that IP system itself, patent, copyright, industrial design, trademarks, and geographical indication, but mainly copyright. Creative Commons, the idea in country not like the others, the unique copyright office located inside the library is in the US, in Congress Library. For that, but copyright, you are a writer, you have your own copyright for during all your life and for the family, and later, after 25 years, anyway, Ernest Hemingway books, 60 years after he died, any editor can publish his books, but it is for a patrimony. Let me arrive. Yes, I will raise it for the panel, not for you. Don't worry. Yes, the digital.
Yeah, would also have very interesting things to say.
Yes, I will give her the mic later. Yes, about the digital ID, because in Switzerland or in other country, in India, it's very interesting, as we raised that brief. In society like India, the main thing, because people, nowadays they have a phone, but doesn't mean having a fixed phone. It used to be a step to having an iPhone. Yes, but in India, digital ID, it's also a mailbox. With anybody have a mailbox in Switzerland, it is a bank account and more. But in no more, but in Switzerland it could be more.
Sir, do you have a question?
Yes, the question about artificial intelligence, I apologize if I share interesting thing or bad thing, but about artificial intelligence, we arrived nowadays on data and more than data. But as you said, it could be somebody who published in Wikipedia, women or to an account. But how about hacking? We have interesting something have been published, yes, scientific, but how about to hack and hacking, which is not really a fact, but hacking in a digital area? Thank you very much. This is my question to you.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll take maybe more questions. Another question, maybe? No? All right. So I think...
Just to your point about scientific, because I was sort of like banging on Wikipedia there. On the other hand, scientific journals have a barrier to entry, again, also in terms of not necessarily being so democratized either. I mean, it is there. I don't think that there's like one answer or another, but I'm not so sure that that old system either let new voices in and new information in when we talk about knowledge production. I just wanted to add balance to my comments. Yes.
If I may, though, one positive development as pertains to scientific journals, but that's really more of your field of expertise than mine, is increasingly funders are fighting the business model of buying scientific journals and then putting it all behind an expensive paywall. So you have a lot of scientific research that is funded by, say, governments, and is then published behind paywalls, and increasingly there is a movement for open access, which means that qualified expertise through scientific publications is made accessible to the greatest number from the World Wide Web. A positive development, I feel.
Maybe there is a point as well to make around either open source communities or hackers and hacking space that Sir mentioned early on as maybe emerging trends or weak signals of democratic practices.
Yeah, I'm grateful that you make this point. This was actually the last slide that I didn't show to some sort of backup the 10th observation or hypothesis. There's a fantastic book by our professor Yochai Benkler. The book's title is The Wealth of Networks. And it goes back to the time of optimism and uses exactly examples like Wikipedia and many other open source, including open source software movements as a illustration of what I think is the key point in all of these references to these examples, as flawed as they are, that we have tools at hand that we didn't have previously that can help us to create alternative futures that can that give us at least some additional ability to reimagine and rebuild new versions, how we collaborate, how we interact, and how we govern ourselves. So, and I do think you're absolutely right that we shouldn't lose sight of this possibility. And what I'm most worried about, and although I'm trying very hard to be an optimist, but what makes me mostly pessimistic around this time of day is it feels, despite all the imagination that we have, whether it's in literature or arts or smart people in communities, leaders, thought leaders like this table and the audience, we have imagination. We have very powerful tools at hand, like more than ever in the history of humanity. The tools we have, the instruments, the technologies available, it's amazing. And yet, the net result is that we follow a path dependency of a deeply unfair, deeply divided, deeply unequitable society. And we're continuing on that path and seem to make things worse by the day, at least if we look at our news portals, right? And I think that's what bothers me, that we don't use the opportunity space that we have. We seem not to be able to make steps in a direction that we could. And why is that? I think that has to do, of course, with the political economy and so forth, and geopolitics and many constraints and realities. But I do think ultimately it has to do with us as humans. And last thing I want to say is why I'm doing what I'm doing is because I believe in young people and the next generation. I'm at the university because I want to support young people, including the ones who are protesting around the world, to do what we, my generation, didn't do, which is to use the imagination we have, to use the tools we have, to build, yes, sometimes flawed next alternative models, but do more of it and iterate on it and make it better as you proposed. And that to me is some sort of what keeps me up in the night, looking at our AI discussions. We're just repeating the same crap and the same crappy society we have been living in and that we all agree is deeply flawed. And that's a problem.
Kathleen, you're working with people around the world, particularly in the global south. Do you see the emergence of sparkles of hope in how technology is developed, or?
Well, yes and no. I've got to say that I'm constantly astounded at the lack of creativity. When we have like money to give away for this feminist AI research network, we kept on, people just can't get, but we're seeing after 3 years that people are starting to say, oh, you would like to give us the space to think about something new. We just had a paper come in from a very brilliant Joanna Barone, who I know that you know, about reimagining AI, the word is wrong, but as compost engineers, to looking at fungal systems, looking at networks of trees, how does biology organize itself? Is that a way for us to look? Just trying to think about different ways, or something as simple as just like public procurement in Ecuador. We have a project on gender-responsive public procurement to see how in a community, working with an indigenous community in Mexico, with who's been voting and drawing and singing, and all the poetry came in, but it's actually also mapping the past and also the future of this river that's actually being diverted, and how they want to manage their resources, how they want to manage their river with AI, but also using all these other sort of traditional storytelling techniques. So I think it's there, but I think that we have to go out and we have to beg people and exhort them to be creative and just say, this is an opportunity for us to invent and to fail and to invent again. And this whole sort of failing upwards of Silicon Valley, except for the public good. And there isn't, I don't think, enough of that conversation. So I'm very happy that I heard you say that.
That was not the activist.
There is a question, yes.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this very insightful conversation. Extremely interesting. Learned a lot. I was wondering if you had insights on the impact AI or these other tools that you talked about had depending on the different audiences, especially looking at the age groups. So you talked about the youth, for example, maybe from a government perspective and also from the research perspective. Thank you.
Well, I know that we have some experts in the audience. Laura, are you here somewhere? I can't see you. Yes? You should take this question.
She's up there.
She's out there.
She's up there.
So I work on the nexus of youth, AI, or tech and climate change. And I'm also going to throw this at Jérôme afterwards. But I'm going to start by saying something maybe a little bit thought-provoking, is that when it comes to youth, especially youth activists and climate activists, the way they looked at discourse around technology and AI is often with skepticism, because they see it as a bit of a diversion. Oftentimes, when it comes to the discourse on technology, it's a very sort of positive, forward-thinking, techno-solutionist sort of discourse. And what they see when it comes to climate is a very different, sort of much less optimistic scenario. And what you see when you attend climate COPs and you talk to climate protesters, really young climate protesters, is that they're very, very skeptical of what's happening on the tech scene because they feel like the money and the interest is going in the wrong direction. So I'll just maybe leave it at that, and then also throw it at Jérôme, with whom I'm working on a project on youth and AI, and let's see what he has to say.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, we're working on a project where we are asking youth to draft stories about the future with AI and about AI. So we have developed, my colleague Laura, Christine, and a colleague in Zurich, a methodology where we do workshops throughout Switzerland and we ask teenagers around the age of 18 in different types of school, high school, apprenticeship, to tell us how they see the future of democracy and what role they give to AI and technology, but more precisely AI in that context. So what we see so far, there is a common, and that links also to what you said, Laura, there is very often a common theme that emerges, which is the environment and the climate context. That is often a question that emerges in these stories about the future, whether the technology is here to find a solution to or to respond or to protect against climate. But there is really this question of resilience of society towards climate that comes as well. Do you have anything to add as well? Please.
So, at the State of Geneva, we're convinced that foresight is one way to deal with these issues. And I feel that's something we've been sort of touching upon, but not directly addressing so far. So foresight, I'm sure you're familiar with, is a methodology, is an approach to do horizon scanning. You try to identify some weak signals. You'll identify a whole set of trends, mega trends, smaller trends. You draw scenarios, and then you imply what should we do to make sure that we reach, amongst the different scenarios, is there a future we'd prefer? And are there actions we can take to reach a future that we find preferable? There might be a probable future, and there might be a future we'd prefer. So that's a good way of engaging these discussions. And so we are convinced that working with universities, with researchers, is essential. Geneva is fortunate to have a lot of brilliant researchers and universities. And so on this specific project, we're working not with a graduate institute that does terrific research, but with the University of Applied Sciences that has a master's in foresight. And we're about halfway, running through a project over 2 years with a group of university master's students with the task of imagining the impact of digital technologies, the future of democracy in 2040 in Geneva in a digital age. What are possible? And I'll just mention 2 scenarios because the students have been working on it. They're 22, 23 years old. So it's another perspective and a view on the whole different transitions that are going on. 2 scenarios that I want to mention. One, full tech. The Swiss government provides a Google-provided digital identity. You can vote on everything all the time, a sort of liquid democracy. And eventually, you just do it with a bot because it has access to all your data, and so it knows better than you do actually what your political preferences are. And basically the whole system is run like that through technology that comes from abroad, very efficient, very smooth. One scenario. Another one is climate change hit Geneva pretty rough. The state failed the population. They don't want to vote anymore. What's the point on voting on complex topics that don't have any impact? And if they do, it'll be in 20 years and we'll have changed things anyway in the meantime. And so people have folded back down onto these little area neighborhood communities, and they're organized in very direct democratic processes on a very, very local level with committees that organize the life in common, while the rest of society sort of has broken down and the voting rate in the formal processes is pretty close to 0. So those are just 2 illustrative scenarios. And I feel what is interesting in that is it challenges us to sort of think not specifically on one technology, but building a view of what society could look like with different moving bits and pieces.
Thank you, Alexander. Maybe a final round of comments and ideas on the future or futures.
Well, we'd like to reimagine. We'd like to have the strength to reimagine, because I think we all agree, failed systems. So this is not the moment then to just make these failed systems have velocity and scale, because we're never going to be able to go back. So this is a fabulous opportunity, and it is a moment to really reflect on what it is that we want to build and how we can include as many different kinds of people who've been excluded up until now, traditionally, into this decision-making process.
It's a wonderful closing.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. And have a nice evening. Thank you.